News!
Okay, we'll start with this, recapping the Joshua Buatsi versus Stepien fight that took place at light heavyweight. Joshua Buatsi was left fighting in a near half-empty venue on his long-awaited return as tons of supporters walked out of the Stepien clash early,
with social media branding it a bore fest while slamming the controversial scorecard.
Ahead of this past weekend's fight, what was Joshua Buatsi's boxer debut and his return to the Sky Sports platform, where he fought for the most part under the Matchroom banner, now the Boxer banner.
I said it then.
I said it in the build-up. Joshua Buatsi would be under pressure to perform because he doesn't have Matchroom, Eddie Hearn, or the DAZN platform to lean on anymore.
Ben Shalom is promoting you now.
At the kickoff press conference for Joshua Buatsi's migration from Matchroom over to Boxer, Joshua Buatsi himself blamed the DAZN platform for his lack of notoriety, his lack of visibility, claiming that enough people don't watch that platform.
Yet most of his fights were on Sky. He didn't box on DAZN but one or two times.
Nevertheless, Joshua Buatsi started singing a familiar tune about the DAZN platform that we've heard many of DAZN's competitors.
He sounded like one of them.
But fans were less than impressed, as plenty of those in attendance at the near 16,000-seater venue decided to exit early while Buatsi competed in the ring. A video on social media shows fans vacating their seats and walking down the stairs towards the various exits.
They were bored.
As the little atmosphere left in the venue was extinguished, boxing fans from different sections of the indoor stadium decided that they would rather beat traffic than watch the 30-year-old extend his undefeated record.
They'd rather beat traffic than watch Joshua Buatsi beat Stepien.
And isn't it ironic that both Joshua Buatsi and Lawrence Okolie, who had some choice words for Eddie Hearn, choice words in reference to the DAZN platform, isn't it funny that since having debuted under the Boxer banner, both fighters have had lackluster showings?
Both of them.
Isn't it ironic because in the moment, at the time those stories first broke, it was the trendy thing to do to take the piss out of Eddie Hearn, take the piss out of Matchroom, take the piss out of the DAZN platform.
It's ironic because on social media you would think that Lawrence Okolie and Joshua Buatsi were onto something, though in the real world, it's a different story. It was a different story. Neither Lawrence Okolie or Joshua Buatsi looked impressive, and maybe that's the real problem. Where these guys think they deserve all this money?
Dollar amounts that exceed their marquee value, fight by fight. Perhaps it's these fighters that are overstating their overall value.
What they're worth.
Lawrence Okolie crossed over from Matchroom over to Boxer because the people at Boxer were willing to pay him more money. And I understand that, I do.
You've got to get while the getting is good.
For Matchroom, who had matching rights on both Lawrence Okolie and Joshua Buatsi, neither Lawrence Okolie or Joshua Buatsi are big ticket sellers. So why break the bank to keep these two guys?
Why overpay?
For me and my money, the red flag when it came to Joshua Buatsi was the Craig Richards fight. Craig Richards, a domestic-level guy that Joshua Buatsi didn't blast out of there.
The guy he didn't dominate.
The red flag for me was Joshua Buatsi's sparse schedule of activity, constant pullouts, withdrawing from fights.
They pulled him out of the Maxim Vlasov fight because they said he was injured.
And they pulled him out of the Jean-Pascal IBF final eliminator because they couldn't agree on the anti-doping tests, something along those lines.
I started to see a pattern forming.
I got the sense that Joshua Buatsi only wants to compete at a certain level at this point in the juncture in spite of his age. Joshua Buatsi's not a guy who's in his early or mid-20s.
He's not a young guy.
And he wants to still continue to compete at a domestic level in spite of being an Olympian. Coming from a decorated amateur background, he wants to stay on easy street. And this emerging pattern...
The guy's 30 years old.
When news broke that Joshua Buatsi rejected both a Dimitri Bivol fight and a Callum Smith fight, it became evident to me that the real issue here is this guy doesn't want tough fights. He wants big money for what are not big fights.
You didn't put distance between yourself and those fighters because those are the fights that you want. You didn't put distance between yourself and those fighters and those fights because you're looking for big fights.
You're not looking for big fights. You're looking for big money, just not big fights.
Tough fights.
For me and my money, Joshua Buatsi is a 30-year-old Olympian who is not confident enough in his abilities that he wanted to share the ring with a Bivol or a Callum Smith. He sought refuge over there at Sky Sports and Boxer, though he knew how it would look.
He knew what people would say.
So he starts carrying on about how nobody subscribed to DAZN and nobody watches the platform.
A deflection.
He starts carrying on about visibility and how he's not quite visible on the DAZN platform as he would be on the Sky Sports platform. But now that he's back on Sky...
Look at the reception. Look at the reaction. People started leaving.
The truth is, this is no more about platforms than it is about the price of tea in China.
The truth is that Joshua Buatsi, at 30 years old, is still not confident enough to share the ring with either world champions or world-class contenders.
The truth is that this is more about Joshua Buatsi's limited ability than limited visibility.
That's the truth.
But because Joshua Buatsi made this about visibility and made this about platforms, that needs to be addressed. That this isn't about people not being able to see you on the DAZN platform. If it were you opposite the ring, somebody like a Bivol or a Smith, people would watch.
But because you don't feel ready for those guys, you don't want those fights.
And now you're on Sky, which is a very big platform, though based on how you performed, who do you think wants to watch you on Sky?
Ben Shalom may have been able to offer both Joshua Buatsi and Lawrence Okolie more money than Matchroom was willing to pay those fighters.
Let's get it straight. It's not that Matchroom didn't have the money, it's that they're not going to fritter it away on those two guys when those two guys ain't big draws.
They're on Sky now.
Under the Boxer banner, because Ben Shalom is willing to overpay, though. You tell me if he's getting his money's worth.
Same thing that happened in the Okolie fight is the same thing that happened in the Buatsi fight. People started leaving.
What impression do you think that leaves on the fight fans, the paying customers, moving forward? How marketable do these fighters seem to you? At some point, Ben Shalom is going to need a return on his investment.
They described Buatsi versus Stepien as a glorified sparring session.
A bore fest. So how excited do you think that makes people about Joshua Buatsi's fights moving forward?
You think they're going to come out in droves to see that guy?
Can't blame it on DAZN anymore. You don't fight there. And Ben Shalom is promoting you now.
You're his headache. You're his problem.
Who is Ben Shalom going to secure for Joshua Buatsi moving forward, since none of the big-name light heavyweights are on that side of the street anyway?
Hell, that's why he went over there.
It's what I always told you. We then come to the Canelo Alvarez versus John Ryder fight, what was Canelo Alvarez's big homecoming.
I think it was the first time he fought in Mexico in 11 years.
The fans themselves showed up and showed out in droves, approximately 50,000 people at the Akron Stadium.
So let's get right into it. What did we see in the fight?
John Ryder, a normally aggressive and come-forward fighter, a volume puncher, he was unable to stay in character opposite the ring Canelo Alvarez due to Canelo's accuracy and sharp shooting. Canelo Alvarez being a boxer puncher,
Counter-puncher.
John Ryder being a pressure fighter, Canelo had the stylistic advantage going into this thing, and that's what you saw from the opening round to the final round.
This was all about shot selection.
Accuracy. When you have a guy who's going to stay in front of you, the way John Ryder's going to try to stay in front of you,
he's given a counter-puncher, a good one, every opportunity to get off those counter shots, get off those right hands, of which there were several throughout the course of this fight. Canelo dropped John Ryder 2 times and hurt him 4.
maybe 5.
Credit to John Ryder for not giving in, not giving up, not quitting, because he could have.
He was never in this fight, you understand. There was never a moment in this fight where he had Canelo in trouble. There was never a moment in this fight where he was in the lead.
He's never in the fight.
Tough and durable, persistent,
Stubborn.
but never in the lead, never in the fight. I feel like John Ryder really endeared himself to the boxing fans by showing,
He's got serious heart, serious grit.
even if he was never in the fight, he wouldn't give up. He wouldn't give in. And that's what fight fans pay to see, the drama.
It's important to note that ahead of this fight, John Ryder was ranked within the top 10 of the super middleweight division. Top 5.
John Ryder, who's normally a handful for anybody that shares the ring with him, Canelo Alvarez was in full control of the situation.
Even if he didn't stop him.
Though many thought he would, myself included.
John wasn't able to dominate the pocket and fluster Canelo Alvarez the way he flusters some other fighters with aggression and activity. I told you ahead of the fight that simply won't work with Canelo because he's a counterpuncher.
Counterpunches feed off a pressure fighter's aggression. Every countering opportunity they're looking for, every countering opportunity they need will be provided by that pressure fighter. That's what we saw.
A badly bloodied John Ryder by, what was it, the second or third round when Canelo broke his nose? It was the first time, according to John Ryder, it was the first time in his entire boxing career that anybody had ever broke his nose.
And that was just in the first quarter. That was just in the first 3 rounds. I don't imagine it was easy for John to try and breathe out of that thing.
I don't imagine it was easy for John to be on the receiving end of so many right hands.
John Ryder, the southpaw, Canelo Alvarez, the orthodox fighter. It just so happens that southpaws in particular, are susceptible to straight right hands, looping right hands.
More so than orthodox fighters.
It all comes down to shot selection, when and where you let go of a shot, and foot placement, where you are relative to where your opponent is.
In spite of Canelo Alvarez dominating John Ryder for all of, 10, maybe 11 rounds, 2 knockdowns, though only one official.
The other was ruled a slip, though the knockdown was off a punch. Looked like a knockdown to me, but that's not how the referee saw it.
Canelo Alvarez knocked this guy down 2 times, hurt him about 4, maybe 5, landed innumerable right hands.
A good number of them that got in. There are still those out there that are nitpicking Canelo Alvarez's performance, claiming that he's lost a step, that he's in decline.
The beating that he put on John Ryder last night south of the border was even worse than the beating David Benavidez put on Caleb Plant.
You heard that right. David Benavidez didn't drop Caleb Plant 2 times.
For perspective, Caleb Plant never once lost his footing in the David Benavidez fight, but last night south of the border, Canelo dropped this guy 2 times.
Get it straight. He broke his nose in the first quarter, dropped the guy 2 times, hurt him about 4 or 5. The beating that Canelo put on John Ryder was far worse than the beating David Benavidez put on Caleb Plant.
And you're telling me that this is your example of how Canelo's in decline, how Canelo's on the back 9?
I think you need a better example, because opposite the ring John Ryder, he was literally in there with a consensus top 10, top 5 super middleweight. No mug.
Oh, you think that Caleb is a better fighter than John?
So let's go with that. Caleb Plant was on the receiving end of the same punches that John Ryder was on the receiving end of, with the difference being that John went the distance and Caleb didn't.
If the argument is that Caleb Plant is a better fighter than John,
Caleb and John share a common opponent and Canelo laid into both of those guys, with the difference being that John was able to go the distance and Caleb wasn't.
Caleb the defensive specialist, Caleb the pure boxer.
So maybe it's not that Canelo's in decline. Maybe, just maybe, John is better than advertised. John is one tough son of a bitch.
One tough mother.
Because I would argue he took even more punches than Caleb Plant did. He took even more punishment, but unlike Caleb Plant, he picked himself up and kept going. He wouldn't give up.
Took a lot of hard shots.
Yeah, Caleb can weather David Benavidez's punches just fine. He could go the distance with a David Benavidez, but with Canelo Alvarez, he got stopped in the 11th.
Stopped in the 11th by Canelo.
The way I see it, John took a lot more punishment, a lot more punches than Caleb Plant did. Opposite the ring, the same guy, but John was able to weather the shots and carry on. Caleb wasn't. So don't slight John Ryder to slight Canelo Alvarez.
Don't.
John's a tough guy. It's that simple.
That's what he is.
Canelo was dominant yesterday, but Canelo Alvarez is always under close scrutiny. He's the only guy who can win 10 or 11 rounds, drop the guy 2 times, break his nose,
And get criticized.
still get criticized.
Even when he wins.
Post-fight, Canelo Alvarez stated that he has no problem fighting David Benavidez, but he says his goal still is fighting Dimitri Bivol at 175 pounds in September, and I maintain my original position. He should forego a Dimitri Bivol rematch and opt to fight the easier, more basic fighter in David Benavidez. There seems to be a palpable demand in the American market for that David Benavidez fight, and from where I'm sitting, David is a lot easier to beat than Dimitri. In this past weekend's fight, dominant as Canelo may have been, he didn't show certain.
He wasn't slipping and sliding, rolling and riding. He wasn't throwing combinations.
He was loading up on his shots, catching and shooting, being very effective while he did it, though, all the same. You'd need combinations for Dimitri. Even if you can't stop him or drop him, you can hope to appear busier in the eyes of the judges. And he didn't show much in terms of combination punching yesterday. He was throwing hard singles, hard counters.
Former Golden Boy employee Roberto Diaz, their former matchmaker, seems to think that Canelo needs to take 2 years off.
Sounds like what Roberto thinks is that Canelo needs to do what Floyd Mayweather did many years ago. Some will remember that Floyd took a 2-year hiatus away from the sport.
There were a lot of people calling his name at that time, and he was subject to some criticism for retiring briefly.
Came back in the Juan Manuel Marquez fight after roughly 2 years away from the sport. I don't know that Canelo Alvarez's pride would allow him to do that.
He still seems focused on Dimitri. I think a rematch is ill-advised. I think he should forego that fight, and if he wishes to revisit it, it should be after he takes out the trash at 168.
I feel like Canelo Alvarez would be better off targeting David Benavidez or Demetrius Andrade in September. These basic fighters, more basic, far more basic than a Dimitri Bivol, a streamlined, nuanced fighter that has already proven to be too much for Canelo Alvarez once. He'd likely do it again in September.
Skip that guy.
Fight David, the so-called Mexican monster, who, in spite of being taller than Canelo Alvarez, longer and younger, is not as accurate as Canelo, doesn't have his ring savvy, his ring IQ, his shot selection.
That's why he couldn't stop Caleb Plant.
It's because he's basic. He's bigger than Canelo and younger than Canelo, but he's basic. He's a big guy that ain't hard to find.
I think the only elite level quality that David Benavidez has is he's got a good engine.
It's the only aspect of David Benavidez's game, if you even want to call it that, that might pose some challenge to Canelo, because Canelo does slow down as a fight progresses.
So when you tack on what punches might get through for Canelo, that he might do more damage to David than anybody has in the past, he might be able to put a dent in him.
That evens things out, balances the scale. Don't forget that David Benavidez has been sat on his back pocket. Canelo hasn't.
Don't forget that David Benavidez is mostly offense and little to no defense, whereas Canelo is more balanced.
And while David Benavidez is bigger than Canelo Alvarez and younger, he's not a hard target to find. He's not the kind of guy to where you got to cut off the ring in order to get off your shots. Try to pin the guy down. In David, what you have is a very big target that's going to bring the fight to you.
You don't have to find him.
With a couple of well-placed shots, Canelo Alvarez may be a bigger puncher, or just as big a puncher as David, with more ring IQ, more ring savvy.
It's a more winnable fight than a Bivol fight.
Dimitri Bivol is a stylistic nightmare, a naturally bigger, rangier fighter that fights on the balls of his feet, longer strides than Canelo, so he can get out of range, well out of range of Canelo's shots. Canelo ain't got the feet for that fight.
Whereas with flat-footed and basic David,
it's a very big target that ain't hard to hit and ain't hard to find. I think he should elect to fight either David Benavidez or Demetrius Andrade, who's had a lot to say over the years.
settle the score with that guy. He's still an unbeaten fighter. I'm sure he's receptive to the fight.
Yet another one of these hype jobs the American fans like to prop up while he's getting dropped by journeymen like Desmond Nicholson.
Benavidez or Andrade in September. That makes more sense to me than a Bivol rematch.
You just fought one pressure fighter and dominated him. Shoot for another in David.